think everybody's getting home from work, so here's all the doors shutting
It's
outside.
okay. Okay, I think we are now streaming on Facebook. Great, fantastic. Okay, welcome in everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and Ed Tarkington today as we discuss his latest book. Pretty much, I will go ahead and read a little bit about the book. I will tell you a little bit about Ed. Ed will go ahead and read a little bit, and then we will do a nice little Q&A section. So this is Ed Tarkington with his newest release, The Fortunate Ones. When Charlie Boykin was young, he thought his life was with his single mother of the working class side of Nashville was perfectly fine. But when his mother arranges for him to be admitted as a scholarship student to an elite private school, he is suddenly introduced to what the world could feel like to someone cushioned by money. That world, he discovered, is an almost irresistible place where one can bend and break rules and still end up untarnished. As he gets drawn into a friendship with a charismatic upperclassman, Archer Cray, and an affluent family that treats him like an adopted son, Charlie quickly adapts to life in the upper echelons of Nashville society. Under their charming and alcohol-soaked spell, how can he not relax and enjoy it all? The lack of anxiety over money, the easy summer spent poolside at perfectly appointed mansions, the lavish parties, the freedom to make mistakes, knowing that everything can be glossed over or fixed. But over time, Charlie is increasingly pulled in covering for Archer's constant deceits and his casual bigotry. At what point will the attraction of wealth and prestige wear off enough for Charlie to take a stand? And will he? So this is a little bit about The Fortunate One by Ed Tarkington. You guys can grab a copy of the book online, visit our store, and just give us a call. So let me go ahead and read Ed's bio. So Ed Tarkington's debut novel, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, was an ABA Indies introduction selection, an Indie Next Picked, a Book of the Month Club main selection, and a Southern Independent Booksellers Association bestseller. A regular contributor to chapter16.org, his articles, essays, and stories have appeared in a variety of publications, including the Nashville Scene, Memphis Commercial Appeal, Knoxville News Centennial, and Lit Hub. He currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee with his doggy, as you guys can see. So thank you so much, Ed, for being here with us today. I will let you go have a few minutes to read over a few pieces, and then we can come back and get right into the conversation. Okay?
Thank you, Kaylee, for that nice introduction. And one thing that is not in my bio is that I attended graduate school, the creative writing program at Florida State University, and I lived in Tallahassee, Florida for 6 years. So this is a little bit of a weird virtual homecoming for me. There was no Midtown Reader when I was a grad student there, but I'm sure had there been, I would have been a regular. I really loved my time in Tallahassee. I lived about 4 blocks off of Lake Ella and spent many afternoons walking a different dog around that lake and driving down to Posey's, which I don't think exists anymore. I think it got taken out by one of the hurricanes for oysters and misadventure. And so it is a special place to me, and I still have a lot of good friends there and people that I love. In fact, just surely coincidentally, the seed of this novel really began when I was living in Tallahassee. I moved to Tallahassee in 2001, just a few months before 9/11. I think it was my second day teaching class at Florida State when we were not allowed to get into the buildings because the terrorists had just attacked New York. And a few months after that, or maybe a year or two after that, I guess it was a year or two after that, in Tallahassee, Governor Bush was dealing with the issue of whether or not to allow a woman named Terry Schiavo to have her feeding tube removed because she was brain dead, and her husband wanted to have her feeding tube removed so that he could remarry because he was Catholic. And her family, her parents didn't want it to happen. And so all of the loonies descended on Tallahassee on both sides of the right to life argument. And it was really kind of, a rubbernecking experience for me to live there and go down and see all the lunacy. I remember watching it on TV in 2000 when they were doing the recount and thinking, oh, that seems pretty interesting. And it was a really interesting time. And I got very invested in that story because it was a very big news story and ended up going all the way to Congress. And I remember thinking to myself, watching some of these Republican politicians, kind of struggling about what to say about this situation, and one in particular who was a doctor, Senator Bill Frist of Tennessee, a native of Nashville, who was a surgeon, had to kind of weigh in on this, and he was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and so he elected to say, without having seen the patient, that he could tell from looking at a videotape that she had brain activity, even though all of her doctors said that she didn't. And I thought to myself, gosh, this is really sort of amazing, because this is a man that I respect, and I know he knows that's not true. But I realized that he feels that he has to say this because that's what his constituency wants to hear, and that he can't maintain power unless he maintains the support of his constituency, of the people who put him in office. And so I got interested in that, and the idea of writing a story about somebody, like what would it take? Like how bad would it have to get before somebody in politics, just couldn't lie to protect their political interests? And I don't say that naively. I don't think that that's something that's just solely about getting reelected. You have to be in office in order to do anything to help people. Then after I left Florida State, I moved here to Nashville, and I teach at the school that is the alma mater of Senator Bill Frist, as a matter of fact, and he's on the board of the school. I haven't personally met him, but I've seen him around. And one of the things that I got to thinking about as I was living here was like, okay, I would like to write a story about, basically, a more humane picture of people on that side of the political spectrum. Certainly when I was in graduate school, everyone that I knew was, left-leaning, very liberal. We definitely had this perception that people who voted the other way were kind of the enemy. And then I, found myself teaching at this prep school that is, has a lot of Republican families. And I realized, boy, they're really nice people. They just see the world in a different way than I do. Their experiences are really different, and their idea of what is good and fair is just different than what mine is. And so that kind of got into my head. And when it was time for me to write a new book, I thought, well, I'd like to kind of play around with that. I'd also like to kind of play around with the widening income gap and the class gap between the people, who were kind of more like more like me, or where I came from, and the people that I was working with, and to try to explain to myself why people, why the poor love the rich, why poor people support politicians who are not at all interested in helping them, or worship, people like Donald Trump, who is, for whatever else you can say about him, he doesn't have a lot in common with sort of the average lower class Walmart shopper. And so the more I thought about that, I found myself interested in this story that of course you've described. I'm going to share just two really short segments from this. One that's really kind of divided into two parts, surrounded by a prologue and an epilogue. The way we begin in this story is you kind of find out where the ending is from the first chapter. So you're sort of, what we're reading through in this novel, we know from the first chapter that something terrible has happened to Arch Cray, the kind of the golden boy, the politician, and the narrator, Charlie, who is his friend from the wrong side of the tracks, is then going to kind of take you back through what led up to this terrible thing happening to Arch, and also to Charlie himself, who at the outset of the story is now a serviceman, a veteran of the Iraq War, and a person who clearly has gone far from where he started. So the first section I'm going to read here, just very short section, which is when Charlie first meets Arch, when his mother takes him to his first day at this really Tony prep school on the other side of Nashville from where he grew up, that she's managed to get him into through means of which he knows nothing, because he's a little boy and he doesn't ask how it happened to be. And he really doesn't know anything about this place except for that it's just dazzling to him when he gets there. So on his first sort of tour day, he has to go for an audience in the headmaster's office, and then he gets introduced to an older boy who's been appointed as his big brother in the school. So I'm just going to start there, just a couple of pages. And this is when they first meet. The headmaster calls, asks his assistant to open the door, and then a moment later, the door opened and closed. I looked up from the floor. There he was, strong jaw and broad shoulders, studiously sloppy, sandy blonde hair. "Hey, bud," the boy said, "I'm Arch Cray." Arch held out his hand for me to shake. "I'm your big brother," he said. "Arch is one of our best," Dr. Dodd said. "You're very fortunate." Dr. Dodd stood. "Well, you boys get acquainted," he said. "Archer, take good care of Charlie, won't you?" "Yes, sir," Arch said. I shook Dr. Dodd's hand for the third time. "We're glad you're here, Charlie," he said. "Thank you, sir," I replied. I followed Arch out of the office and we descended the stairs and walked out into the quad. The air was hot and scented with ginkgo blossoms. "So what do you think of Yateman so far?" he asked. "It's great," I said. I didn't want to tell the truth, that I felt frightened and woefully out of my depth. "Wait until school starts," he said. "You ever take Latin before?" "No," I said. "It's an absolute bitch. I think Yateman might be the last school on earth that still requires Latin. It's supposed to boost your SAT score, but I think they mostly hold on to it for the sake of tradition." I'd not yet heard of the SAT, but I nodded as if this benefit was something I'd already considered. "That's a big thing around here, you know," he said. "Tradition." He spoke the word in a tone both mocking and sincere. Arch had been my class schedule. The ritual, it seemed, was for each of the big brothers to tour his protege from room to room. As we walked, he spoke to me with genial familiarity, passing on occasion to point something out or wave to someone across the quadrangle. I was too captivated by his allure to remember anything but the sound of his voice, the way he walked, the casual confidence with which he carried himself, how he inhabited the navy blazer and regimental tie as if he had been the model for which all prep school uniforms had been designed. So from there, Arch takes Charlie under his wing and introduces him, draws him into the world of the fabulously wealthy, not just rich, but extravagantly so. And understandably, for a boy who comes, from a very, very literally impoverished background, his mother, a single mom, just, working as a cocktail waitress for tips, just kind of barely getting along. He falls into this world pretty readily and easily, as most of us are, dazzled by beautiful and shiny things. He goes further into it. Eventually, there's a kind of shocking revelation that causes Charlie to sort of run away from this world for a while. But eventually, Arch draws him back in about 10, 12 years later in their adult life. And that's where the second half of the novel takes place, is in their adult life. Arch has returned to Nashville after going off to school and becoming a hedge fund manager. And around this time, he's brought Charlie back from where he's been living as an artist in Mexico. Charlie becomes a painter. And Arch has decided to get into politics. And he decides to start his political career by running for mayor of Nashville. And that's where I'll just read this short section about his entry into politics, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about it. Arch's sole experience in politics had been a term on the school board, where his most memorable accomplishment had been a concerted effort to blow the whole thing up. Citing irreconcilable dysfunction and well-intentioned but incompetent members, Arch had sent a letter to the mayor's office and the news media calling for a resolution to disband the elected school board and return to a system where the mayor appointed representatives of his own choosing. "Speaking as one myself, I believe our school board representatives want what's best for our young people," Arch had written in the letter, "but as a whole, we lack the experience, expertise, and available time to accomplish our aims." Off the record, he'd been blunt. "It was an idiot circus," he told me, "run by some of the stubbornest jackasses who ever stumbled out of the barn." The initiative died, but its failure turned out to be a boon for Arch. The newspaper painted him as a truth-telling idea man. He didn't have the support of the mayor's office or the city council, but he had the papers, especially the Herald, owned by Engage South, a media company belonging to a Yateman alum. And the television stations could never resist a pretty face. Arch looked like a savior to the white working class, just as disgust with politicians was peaking. How did a guy like Arch Cray, born into wealth, educated privately from pre-K through graduate school, married to the daughter of a billionaire, as handsome as a film star, with family ties going back almost to Jamestown, become a man of the people? After all, the people were the ones who shopped at Walmart, who spent their lives traveling back and forth between backbreaking jobs and weary inertia at home, who ended up being forced to live off disability and Medicaid benefits. How on earth could the people see a guy who lived on Belmead Boulevard as their champion? There is nothing in this world to which people connect more willingly in uncertain times than the appearance of genuine certainty. If there was one true thing that could be said about Arch, it was this: he seems so sure of himself that people couldn't help but believe in him. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So now, let's just go ahead and dive in.
Sure.
So, do you think that what you've written, your idea behind, when you were writing this book, do you still think it's true to today? Do you still think, there's clearly this fascination with the wealthy, and that we believe that, some wealthy people just they can do no wrong because of the wealth that they have and whatnot? Do you still strongly, believe that and see that, day to day?
Well, I don't know that I ever believed that, but I believed that there was a sense that, I hear a lot, it seems almost these days that wealth and success are synonyms in so many people's minds. Now, I wasn't raised to think of success as being defined by wealth, but that's what you hear a lot. Sometimes people will say, you should really listen to him. He's a really successful man. And what they mean is he's really rich. And, certainly I believe that I know from a lot of people that I know who voted for President Trump, that was why they voted for him, because they considered him to be a successful businessman. And they thought that, his, demonstration of great affluence proved that he knew how to win and how to succeed. And he talked a lot about winning and succeeding. And so I think that there's a sort of idea that, okay, they may not necessarily be the kindest or most likable people, but they know how to win and how to get things done. I don't really think, these days, lately, I just watched last night. I never watched it before. My editor told me, she was like, you really got to watch this show Succession. It's a lot like your book. And I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's about a really rich family. It's sort of based on Rupert Murdoch, who's the chairman of Fox News Corporation, and that is not a show that makes you think that that wealthy people are good people. It's kind of a hate watch, right? It's like people, I think it's really, really popular, and it's won a bunch of Emmy Awards, and it seems to me that what is fascinating to people about that is that it invites them into a sort of love-hate relationship with the rich. You hate them because they're out of touch and callous and narcissistic, but you like their yacht and you like their plane, and you think, boy, I wouldn't mind, hanging out with people who've got stuff like that. I wouldn't mind being invited to go on the private jet or on the yacht. And so I do think that there's a seduction in it. And I don't think that Americans as a whole really want things to be fair and equal. They want to have access to what the people at the top of the pyramid have. And so I do think there's a kind of fascination with it and a desire to understand what it's like to be one of those people and what it takes to become one.
Yeah, I would pretty much, in other words, like they're always kind of chasing that status that
Mhm.
they ideally are, they're trying to, get that. And so that brings me to my second question. Were you worried when you're writing this piece that you would receive backlash about it, that people will look at it and say, well, I don't see it this way, or I disagree? I mean, I feel like that comes with pretty much any piece that's ever written, is there's always going to be someone that doesn't agree. But what were your thoughts?
That's a great question. I did not think about that much at all until after, the book was basically on the verge of being published. And then it started to occur to me, oh yeah, I actually know some people who might not like this depiction of the world that I'm rendering here. Uh, and I did actually get one really kind of hostile message email from, a woman that I know who is, kind of in philanthropy and I, got to know her through the book community here. And, I wrote her back and just sort of said, gosh, I really don't know, why this is so upsetting to you. It's not any different than the way that wealth is depicted in almost any other novel. And I guess that was the thing that I kind of came back to in my own defense. And I don't even really think it's a defense. I say this to my students all the time. You know, name a novel in which the guy who was born rich and had everything from the get-go is the hero.
Mhm.
Name a novel in which a rich person appears in which wealthy people appear and none of them are depicted as being callous and selfish and narcissistic and villainous. You can't do it. I just finished teaching Pride and Prejudice. I love that book. I always say to my students, I'm like, enjoy this, boys, because this is the only book you're ever going to read where the rich guy turns out to be the good guy.
Mhm.
But even in that book, there are a lot of other examples of people who are very affluent that are kind of nasty and
Mhm.
snobbish and cruel. Great Expectations, The Great Gatsby, to which this book has been compared, not by my choice or doing. I'm certainly flattered by that comparison. But this is not a story, no story about the American dream or about wealth or the way things go for the people who have, all the affluence and power. Now, this is not to say that there aren't fabulously wealthy people who are kind and nice and decent. They just don't make very interesting subjects for novels.
There we go. Yeah.
So I think that when it all comes kind of back to it, that's sort of where you come from. I don't think this is an indictment of everything. And the other thing I would say, just as a final part to answer that question, is that I don't think that my people here, Arch is not, he's not a villain. He's not a hero, but he's not a villain either. He's a human being with flaws who makes mistakes and has, moments of bad choice. Now, Charlie is a guy who looks very, has a very jaundiced view of all of this until the very end, when I think he comes to realize that he had been unfair and misjudged a lot of the people that he encountered because of his own envy and his own sense of exclusion from that world. And he kind of has to make his peace with that at the end. So I think that, in the end, nobody's all bad, and that was something that was important to me. I didn't want to have any heroes or villains in this story. Charlie is not a hero, and Arch is not a villain. They're people, and they're chipped and flawed, and in some ways those flaws can be forgiven, and in other ways they're going to exact a price.
Yeah. I can definitely see why, people would compare your piece to The Great Gatsby, because, it mimics that same style where there's not necessarily a hero and a villain, but it's how we interpret, what people are saying and their actions and whatnot. And what would you say was the hardest part when you were writing this piece?
Gosh, that's a difficult question. I think the hardest part for me probably was the fact that, I had set out to write a novel about, wealthy people getting involved in politics. And I started it, probably about January of 2016. And this was around the same time that my first novel, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, was published. And my agent had asked me, so what are you working on? And I had a couple of different things, and she liked this one the best, and she pitched it to my publisher, and they signed it up. And then November rolls around, and Donald Trump gets elected president, and it was, of course, all of a sudden just this sort of crazy, just like reality TV show turns out to be overtaking the world of politics. And so what I had thought of as being kind of crazy or extreme in my novel suddenly seemed really tame, And I thought, oh gosh, my guy is so sort of like sane and normal and decent compared to what we're seeing on TV every day. People are, it's not loud enough. It's not, it's not extreme enough anymore. And I don't know that I really want to step into that. And that gave me a lot of self-doubt, and I kind of flinched for a while there. And I don't know that I would have kept going if it wasn't already under contract, and I had to kind of finish it. So it changed the way that I wrote it. I kind of stepped back a little bit, and it became much more about relationships than about politics. And I really kind of all along just wanted it to be about that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted, my whole idea was to just illustrate how relationships filter out into the larger world, and how people are impacted, that you don't know, by the relationships of the people in power. But then after it, when we got to pub date and it started to come out, I started to realize, like that second passage that I read right there, which I wrote before Trump was elected president, I felt like, okay, well, people are going to see, it doesn't have to be that loud and crazy for people to understand. And then just even more kind of coincidentally, just a couple of weeks ago in my home state of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin was elected governor. He's a hedge fund manager who just jumped into politics out of nowhere and got elected primarily by attacking the public schools, which is exactly what Arch does in the novel. It's like, I can't claim to be, prophetic or anything like that, but it is exactly the same thing. Very similar type of person, very similar trajectory. And so I started to think, well, maybe I was on to something there, and maybe it was the right book to write. But it definitely, things will happen. The world will change when you're writing a book in ways that will make you think, okay, now this maybe isn't the right thing to write anymore. But I think that, for anybody that's out there that's thinking about writing or dealing with, these kinds of issues, you kind of just have to stay true to your story and not allow the noise outside of you to influence what you're doing, because you can't predict what's going to be going on in the world by the time the book comes out. And sometimes your timing is very, very good, and sometimes your timing is very, very bad. But you have no control of that. You just have to write the story that you have in your heart and your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree. That tied into another question of mine. So was, when the election was announced, did you decide, will I stop writing this piece? Do I put this down? But since you're already under contract, you're like, okay, we got to keep going with this. And then, we see this again when COVID-19 takes over, and all these set books that were supposed to come out are suddenly like, okay, do we still push this out? Do we let people know about us, or do we postpone because of what the current pandemic and whatnot? And so when you were coming up with the layout of this piece, did you already know that you were wanting to kind of do the two parts where it was like them as children and then them when, 10, 20 years later? Like you were already said that this was the layout that it was going to look like.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that's sort of been interesting to me and fun or funny is that, I'm very flattered by the comparison to The Great Gatsby that my friend Paula McLean made, and certainly that's a nice blurb to have on the front of your book, and some of the reviews have brought that up. But honestly, I never thought about The Great Gatsby. I was really thinking about a book called Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh that is not nearly as well known. It's much better known in England. He's a British writer. It was pretty popular in the late 40s and 50s, but it never, it kind of, disappeared. It's not really taught in US schools unless you're taking like a 20th century British literature class in college. And even then, you might not encounter it. Um, and I was sort of emulating the structure of that novel because it does kind of the same thing where it starts out with these guys making friends in college, and then there's a separation. And then the second half of the novel is the same relationships in kind of adulthood, early middle age. And I really liked the way that that worked. And I thought, and I don't think, everybody, anybody who tells you that they weren't, looking for inspiration somewhere or modeling their structure on some other novel, I don't believe them. And I don't think you should either. So that really was the one for me. And I just loved it. I thought, okay, yeah, I like the way that this kind of ties things up together. I like my novels to have scope. Both of my novels so far, cover decades. I like that old style. If I could, they'd be, if anybody had the patience, I'd make them a lot longer. But that was very apparent to me. And I never hesitated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought, because I'm not necessarily a writer myself, so I don't dive into it, but I'm a big reader and movie buff. And
Right.
anytime that we see that time jump that comes out, you're always like, okay, how would this really, we want to know what happened in that in between time, what really, after they left and now we're seeing them in a different light, what really made them who they are today. So I'm glad to hear that, you were like, yeah, we have to show both sides of it. And, we get the character development at the beginning, and now we're seeing where they're at today. And so that's really nice. So when writing this piece, why did you decide to, why the school at first? What made you decide, okay, we're going to do a prep school? Pretty much what pushed you towards that light?
Well, I work in a prep school,
Yeah.
and I, am constantly interested in all the little dramas that I observe. I'm definitely, moved in my heart by the experiences of my students on both sides of the socioeconomic spectrum. I definitely got interested in exploring what it would feel like, what it does feel like for a person of extremely limited means to go to a school where a lot of his or her classmates or their classmates are extravagantly wealthy and well-meaning, but really kind of not at all aware of what it's like to to go hungry sometimes, or to wonder whether or not the lights are going to get turned off at the end of the month. And then, for a kid like that to be invited over to, spend the night at his new friend's house, and the front hallway of the house is twice as big as any home this kid's ever lived in. And they've got everything that you could possibly imagine. And it just seems unreal. And I thought, wow, that's a really fascinating place to be. And I think that the culture of, private schools, independent schools, prep schools, because it's so traditional and ritualized, there's always, a kind of, I don't want to say glamour, but allure about this, right? I certainly felt that. Another sort of interesting fact about where I work is the screenwriter of a movie called Dead Poets Society that came out when I was a teenager and is now, I think, kind of a classic. I see you're nodding and smiling. I know you know what I'm talking about. He went to this school and he based it on his experiences there. And the Robin Williams character is based on this kind of unconventional young English teacher that he had at the school back in the 70s. And I love that. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons I became a teacher. I was just completely smitten by Robin Williams's unconventional English teacher. And of course, it didn't occur to me when I was, seeking him as inspiration that, he gets fired at the end of the movie, right?
Yeah.
But uh, our school takes a lot of pride in that, and we actually have a hallway in the classroom building where I teach named after the Dead Poets Society, and we sort of see the culture that we've created as being one that has a lot more in common with Mr. Keating than with the old school headmaster who fires him. And so that made me think, it would be sort of interesting to do something like that, to kind of go back in time and look at what this place was like, or imagine what a place like this was like before I would have been a student here, and certainly before I came here as a teacher. And I had to do some research. As I say, I had never set foot in Nashville until 2007. So all of this action in this novel takes place long before I'd ever even thought about living here. But I have some friends who grew up here. And I do, even though the school is imagined, I definitely depended on what I had learned about the culture of schools like this from the one where I'm working to create it. And one of the things that I probably take the most pride in is that people who have lived here all their lives have told me that they were really surprised when they found out that I didn't grow up here, because they thought that I got it right. And that makes me feel very fortunate.
So would you say that unintentionally the characters in your story are based off of some of the students and the experiences that you have came across working at the school?
No,
No.
100%
Okay.
no. There's only one character in the novel that is explicitly based on a retired colleague, a teacher who had been there for many, many years, the Dean Varnado, the Latin teacher. When I first started working there, I was in a classroom across the hall from this guy, and he just kind of awed me and scared me and made me feel like, boy, I'm never going to be a great teacher like him. And he had such a, really like central casting kind of, just presence that made him seem like he ought to be a character in a movie or a novel. And so I decided, all right, I'm going to have a little tribute to my friend Andy Gaither here. But otherwise, no, it was really important to me to stay as far away from that as possible. If anything, most of it, the things that I know of that are kind of rooted in truth really came out of my college experiences in the early 1990s. And I've definitely been getting a lot of emails and text messages over the past year from my college friends saying, hey, I remember when that happened, or, quoting some line that I took straight out of the mouth of one of my friends in 1991 or something like that. But no, I really, and I understand that people, and even people around here, probably are tempted to think that that is, that this is some sort of expose. And I understand why people do. A lot of the marketing of books is sort of trying to make you feel that it's like real and urgent, and ripped from the headlines. But the job of a fiction writer is to use their imagination. And that's what I try to do. And I'm very much against exposing people that I know or that I care about in that way. I think that it's not so much a betrayal as laziness on the part of the writer, that you can't think up something on your own, and or take the tiny little seeds of things that are real but transform them into something that bears no resemblance to where they came from. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify that.
Yes, of course. I have the marketing background. And so when we are, marketing a book, it's more so we want that personal connection. So of course I had to ask, was this a personal connection? Did this come from inside of you? And you just had all these experiences laying around and you're like, okay, let's write this piece. So thank you so much for clarifying that. So we'll go ahead and move over into like the QA section from the audience. So I'm just gonna, I I have Facebook Live going right now. Okay. So what was your writing style for this book? Were you a morning writer, a night writer, and the day writer?
I tend now, when I'm starting something, I usually try to start in the summer when I'm not working, and I can devote, 6 or 8 hours at a time, with little breaks in between, but I can really kind of be a full-time writer. And I actually, part of the reason I wrote that middle section set in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, was that I was there when I wrote about 100 pages of this book, and I just was like, oh, I love this place so much, I want to write about it. And I wrote by hand. I try to write by hand when I'm getting started, just because it enables me to avoid being tempted to go online. I'll take my computer and my phone and put them on the other side of the house from where I'm going to work. So long as I, know that I can be reached if there's an emergency, and just try not to touch them. And then once I've kind of got my wheels rolling, and the summer comes to an end, and I go back to a more disciplined life schedule, and also have to, do what most people should do when they have young kids, which is be involved in their care and transportation. I write early in the morning. I get up about, these days 4:30. I used to get up at 3:30, but I'm getting older and I don't have the stamina. I need a little more sleep. But I get up about 4:35 and write for an hour or two in the morning. I've heard a lot of people say lately, somebody told me I wasn't there, but Lauren Groff was in Nashville a couple weeks ago, and my friend told me that she had said she likes to do the same thing, get up really early, because when you're sort of half awake, you can imagine a little bit better, and you're not yet thinking about all the stuff you have to do today. And you can kind of, if you keep that time period in the morning, the house is really quiet, everybody else is sleeping, and there's really nothing that you can be doing, like work-wise, like you can't call anybody on the phone or anything like that. You can just sort of space out and play with your imaginary friends, and that tends to work for me.
Yeah, I mean, I am, as much as I hate it, I like to get up at 5 to get work done rather than stay up late. I'm like, I'd rather just go to sleep and just get up and do it, because that way, I know no one will be calling me and there is nothing urgent, and I will have the time to completely focus.
Yes.
How many rough drafts did you have for this piece?
That's a good question. I don't really, I think that the whole concept of rough drafts has probably evolved a lot now that a lot of us do our work on word processors, because you are, tinkering with the document as opposed to printing it out and correcting it and then, retyping it. This book did go through 2 major revisions. One that I did myself before I sent it to my editor, and then one that my editor and I worked on together. And really the second one, we really cut out a lot and moved things around. And I had a very fortunate experience of working with a brilliant and involved and committed editor. And we actually met here in Nashville and spent several hours just kind of blocking it out and sort of talking through, okay, well, if we're going to take this out, then how's this person going to get from point A to point B if this didn't happen? Or what is his motivation to do this if that didn't happen? And we were able to bounce those ideas off, and then I went back home and wrote it. And so it was a lot shorter and a lot different. It was very different. And then, you kind of go through one more major proofread before you send it to the managing editor, then they edit it, then they send it to the copy editor, then you get another chance. So, you could technically say that it was probably 5 or 6 drafts. But I think in the olden days before word processors that, people might have 13, 14, 15 drafts, because they would have to, the first draft would be a typewritten manuscript and you have 1 copy rather than a file. So if I were doing it that way, who knows, might have been 100.
Sorry, my light
That's okay.
turned off. Guess I wasn't moving enough. um, so if you had to point out three major takeaways from this piece, what would they be?
Okay. Number one would be that we're all living the same story. It just keeps happening. And the fact that this book can be compared to The Great Gatsby or any other book that was written 100 years ago really doesn't tell you so much that I'm trying to write like that. It tells you that that is a story that keeps telling itself and continues to be relevant. The conflict between the rich and the poor, those in power and those subject to their power, that is a story as old as stories. And we're just reinventing it in different ways. The second thing that I would take away from it is, sort of what I said before. In most cases, we've had some things happen in the last couple of years that put this to the test, but in my experience, most of the time, nobody is all bad or all good. There are no heroes and villains. They're just human beings, and we're all subject to making mistakes, and we're all, conditioned by our environments and our biases. So what I always want, my characters to do is in this novel especially is to complicate and humanize people that in other media are really flat. If there's one thing that really bugs me about social media right now, it's not so much the bias as it is the flattening of everything and the way that everything is made into a soundbite or a stereotype, and that's just not how the world works. And we gotta remember that most of us are human beings doing the best we can. I know there are some bad people out there. There's some jerks. I'm not trying to redeem anybody who's irredeemable, but that is not true, I think, of most people. And even the bad people don't wake up in the morning thinking to themselves, I'm going to go be evil today. They think they're right. Thirdly, I really don't, I think what I want you to take away from it is what you bring to it. I don't really believe that novels teach us anything. I believe that novels reveal to us what we already knew but could not articulate. And I think that only novels can do that because ideas don't really exist until they take form in language. So feelings don't really matter until they get articulated in words. They matter, but they don't kind of have shape or really definite meaning. And so when I read a book, what I discover, what I learn is a little bit more about who I am and where, I understand myself better. I ask myself, why does this upset me? Or why does this excite me? Or why am I more interested in this or more persuaded by this than by that? And it helps me to be more patient, more thoughtful, more generous, less likely to judge, less self-righteous. And I'm happy about that because I want to be a better person. And I'm not saying that, read my book to be a better person. I'm saying when you read this novel or any novel, don't expect it to tell you something that you never thought about. Expect it to help you or hope that it will help you articulate something that you'd felt but just hadn't really been able. When you read something and you feel like, yes, okay, that's exactly what I thought or exactly what I mean, or you said it perfectly, then what that's really doing is it's just helping you to know yourself a little bit better. And that's a kind of magic that stories do that is completely independent of the work of the writer. It really has a lot more to do with who the reader is and what they bring to the story.
Oh, that was
That's
great. I love that. That was So good. I also, I think that a lot of the times we resonate with certain books and pieces because of like our own thoughts and actions and everything behind it. And I'm always like, wow, this book changed my life. And it's more so like it has like, I've just connected so much with it. And so that's so nice to hear. So my last question before we go ahead and wrap up, I always like to end it on this question. If you had to sell your book in a sentence, what would it be?
The old elevator pitch question. Well, I guess uh, the one that I was using before when people were asking me, what's your book about? I would say it's a cross between Brideshead Revisited and All the King's Men in the recent past, with rich people behaving badly and poor people learning the hard way that being rich ain't everything. I might change Brideshead to The Great Gatsby now, since I've figured out that I'm one of a very few people that remember what that book's about anymore. But yeah, that would probably.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. Is there anything else you would like to say before we close out for the night?
Just thank you so much, Kaylee, for having me. And for anybody who watches this now or later, please remember to support your independent bookstore. Go to Midtown Reader, buy your books there. I would love it if you bought mine, but regardless, go and keep these businesses open and support them. The events that we enjoy, Amazon does not host book events. And if you want to have a local book culture, you got to buy your books from the independent bookstore. And man, you'll be glad that you did. I love walking into my independent bookstore. I just did it the other day. I walked in with a list and I said, okay, I walked up to one of the booksellers that I knew and I said, these are the people that I got. This is what they're like. This is kind of, just help me. That is something that you can only get in an independent bookstore. I'm very grateful for the culture that you all are continuing to facilitate. I am a huge indie proponent for reasons that go beyond my career as a reader and a father of readers. And so that is the last thing I want to say. Support your indie bookstore, buy indies first. Let's go.
Thank you so much, Ed. And I hope when you come back to Tallahassee, you'll make sure to stop by Midtown Reader.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait. I'm dying to come in the flesh next time.
Yes, of course. We just celebrated our 5 years. So, we're hoping for 5 more. So make sure to stop on by. You can all grab a copy of The Fortunate Ones online by visiting the store or giving us a call. So thank you so much for tonight. And I hope everyone has a great and safe night.
Yes,
Bye, Ed.
thank you.